You know that feeling when your own child looks at you like you're a stranger? When the person you raised, fed, protected, and loved for 30 years suddenly decides you're not worth a seat at their table anymore? I'm Julia, and this is the story of how I discovered that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who can hurt us deepest. It was a Tuesday morning in November when my phone buzzed with a message that would change everything. I was sitting in my small kitchen, the same one where I'd made countless birthday cakes, packed thousands of school lunches, and nursed my son Ethan through every fever and heartbreak. The autumn light filtered through curtains I'd sewn myself 20 years ago, creating patterns on the table where I'd helped him with homework night after night, when his father decided we weren't worth staying for. "You're banned from Thanksgiving, Mom." 5 words, 28 characters including spaces. That's all it took to erase 3 decades of my life. I stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold in my hands, reading those words over and over until they blurred. Surely there was some mistake. Surely my Ethan, my baby who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who once told me I made the best pancakes in the whole world, couldn't have written something so cruel, so final. But there it was, sent from his number, in his typical abbreviated texting style. No explanation, no apology, just a digital execution, swift and merciless. The worst part wasn't the rejection itself. It was the complete absence of emotion in those words. Like I was a problem to be solved, an inconvenience to be managed. Like 30 years of sacrifices, of putting his needs before mine, of working double shifts to pay for his college while wearing shoes with holes in them, had been reduced to this: "You're banned." I set the phone down with trembling hands and looked around my kitchen. Every surface held memories of the boy who had just dismissed me. The height marks on the doorframe where I'd measured his growth year after year. The small burn mark on the counter from when he tried to surprise me with breakfast in bed for Mother's Day and nearly set the house on fire. The refrigerator covered with his drawings, report cards, and photos spanning decades of a life I thought we'd built together. But apparently, I'd been building alone. My mind raced back to the last few months, searching for signs I'd missed. Since Ethan's promotion at the law firm and his marriage to Charlotte, our relationship had grown distant. Phone calls became shorter, visits less frequent. When they did come by, Charlotte would sit rigidly on my couch, her designer clothes and perfect makeup making my modest home feel shabby in comparison. She'd check her phone constantly, making it clear she had better places to be. I'd tried so hard to win her over. I'd asked about her work, complimented her outfits, even changed my traditional family recipes to accommodate her dietary restrictions. When she mentioned wanting to redecorate their guest room, I'd offered to help, only to be told they'd hired a professional designer. When I suggested we start a new tradition of Christmas cookie baking, she'd politely declined, saying they preferred store-bought from that expensive bakery downtown. Every attempt at connection was met with a wall of polite indifference, but Ethan just stood by, silent, letting her subtle rejections pass without comment. The son who once defended me against playground bullies now watched his wife dismiss me with the same detached interest he might show a stranger's conversation. I should have seen this coming. The signs were all there, painted in increasingly bold strokes across months of careful distancing. The way Charlotte would whisper to Ethan during family dinners, causing him to glance at me with newfound irritation. The way they'd make plans in front of me, vacations, dinner parties, weekend trips, without ever extending an invitation. The way my son's responses to my texts grew shorter and less frequent until I felt like I was bothering him every time I reached out. But Thanksgiving? That was supposed to be sacred. For 30 years, it had been our tradition. Even during his rebellious teenage years, even when he went away to college, even through his father's abandonment and our lean years when we could barely afford a turkey, Thanksgiving was ours. It was the one day when I could show my love through food, through tradition, through the simple act of gathering around a table and remembering what we meant to each other. I'd already started planning this year's menu, had begun saving money for the ingredients. I'd even bought a new tablecloth, hoping to make everything perfect for Charlotte's first Thanksgiving with our family. I imagined her finally seeing me as worthy, finally understanding that love doesn't always come wrapped in designer packages, but sometimes arrives in the form of homemade cranberry sauce and stories shared over candlelight. Now I understood why she'd asked so many questions about the meal during their last visit. What time we usually ate, how many people came, what dishes I traditionally prepared. I'd thought she was showing interest, maybe even wanting to contribute. I'd been foolish enough to feel hopeful, thinking we might finally connect over the planning of this special day. She hadn't been interested in joining our tradition. She'd been gathering intelligence to exclude me from it. If you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. Comment and let us know what city you're watching from. The silence in my kitchen felt deafening now. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Outside, neighbors were starting their day, heading to jobs and lives that continued moving forward while mine had just stopped completely. I looked at my hands, weathered from years of hard work, marked with small scars from cooking accidents and late-night craft projects for school fundraisers. These hands had touched his fevered forehead, tied his shoes when he was too small to manage, applauded at every school play and sporting event. These hands were now banned from setting his table. I thought about calling him, demanding an explanation. But what would I say? How do you ask your own child why you're no longer welcome in their life? How do you beg for the love you thought was unconditional? How do you explain to someone who once lived in your body that being rejected by them feels like dying while still breathing? Instead, I sat in my kitchen and let the coffee grow cold, staring at those 5 words until they burned themselves into my memory forever. You're banned from Thanksgiving, Mom. The message that taught me the difference between being a mother and being wanted. But I was about to teach them both something about consequences. The days following that message blurred together in a haze of disbelief and growing humiliation. I kept checking my phone, waiting for a follow-up text that would explain it was all a misunderstanding, maybe even an apology. But Ethan's silence was as deliberate as his cruelty. I tried to convince myself there had to be a reason. Maybe Charlotte was having family drama and wanted a small, intimate gathering. Maybe they were planning to surprise me with something special, and this was just poor communication. Maybe my son, who I'd raised to be thoughtful and kind, couldn't possibly mean to cast me aside so callously. So I did what mothers do when their children hurt them. I made excuses and waited for him to come to his senses. On Thursday, I called him. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. His professional voice, the one he used for clients, requested that I leave a detailed message and he'd return my call at his earliest convenience. I hung up without saying a word. My son was treating me like a telemarketer. I tried again on Friday. This time, Charlotte answered. "Oh, hi, Julia," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced politeness that made every word feel like a small slap. "Ethan's in a meeting. Can I take a message?" It was 8:30 at night, on a Friday. I knew my son's schedule better than she did. He was probably on their couch, watching her scroll through her phone while he played games on his laptop. But I played along with her charade. "I was hoping to talk to him about Thanksgiving," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. "There seems to be some confusion about the plans." The pause that followed stretched long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. When Charlotte finally responded, her voice had shifted from false politeness to something colder, more honest. "There's no confusion, Julia. We've decided to host our own Thanksgiving this year, with people who share our values and lifestyle. I'm sure you understand. Our values and lifestyle. As if loving your child unconditionally, sacrificing your own dreams to ensure theirs came true, and building a life on genuine connection rather than material success were somehow inferior principles. As if 30 years of putting Ethan first had left me morally deficient in her estimation. What about Ethan?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. "Can I speak to him directly?" "He's really swamped with work," Charlotte replied smoothly. "But I'll let him know you called. Have a good evening, Julia." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me holding a dead phone and the growing certainty that my son was sitting right there, letting his wife handle his dirty work. The boy who once insisted on answering the phone himself whenever I called, who used to talk my ear off about his day, his friends, his dreams, was now hiding behind his wife's skirts while she delivered his rejections. That weekend, I drove by their house. I don't know what I hoped to accomplish. Maybe I thought seeing me on their doorstep would remind Ethan of who I was, who we'd been to each other. Maybe I believed that face to face. He couldn't maintain this cold distance. Their neighborhood was one of those pristine developments where every lawn looked professionally manicured, and every house seemed to compete for some unstated prize of architectural perfection. Ethan's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, its brick facade and perfectly symmetrical landscaping making it look like something from a magazine rather than a home where people actually lived. I parked across the street and watched through their front window as they entertained guests. I could see Charlotte gliding between rooms in a flowing dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, carrying appetizer trays and laughing at conversations I couldn't hear. Ethan stood near their granite kitchen island, wearing a sweater I'd never seen before, gesturing animatedly as he told some story to a circle of people who hung on his every word. They looked happy, successful, complete, without me. I watched my son in his beautiful house with his beautiful wife and their beautiful friends, and I realized he wasn't missing me at all. This wasn't some temporary aberration in our relationship that would naturally correct itself with time and patience. This was intentional, calculated. They had examined my place in their lives and found it wanting. When I finally drove home, my small house felt even smaller. The photos on my mantle, dozens of pictures spanning Ethan's life from infancy to adulthood, looked like evidence of a relationship that existed only in my memory. Every frame contained a smile that now felt manufactured, a hug that seemed forced, a moment of apparent connection that had apparently meant more to me than to him. I started noticing things I'd been too hopeful to see before. During his last few visits, Ethan had never asked about my life. He didn't inquire about my health, my finances, my loneliness. He'd sit in my living room checking his phone while I bustled around trying to make him comfortable, bringing him snacks he barely touched and asking questions about his work that he answered with increasing brevity. When had I become so desperate for his attention that I'd accepted crumbs of affection as if they were banquets? When had I started measuring my worth as a mother by his willingness to tolerate my presence rather than enjoy it? The signs had been there for months, maybe even years. The way he'd started introducing me to his colleagues as my mother rather than my mom, as if the informal term was somehow embarrassing. The way he'd stopped mentioning our shared memories, those stories that used to make us both laugh about his childhood adventures and my rookie parenting mistakes. The way he'd started looking at me with the same polite disinterest Charlotte showed, as if I were a pleasant but irrelevant stranger rather than the woman who'd shaped his entire existence. Monday brought another humiliation. I was grocery shopping, walking through the aisles where I'd taught Ethan to comparison shop and read nutrition labels, when I heard familiar laughter from the next aisle over. I turned the corner, and there they were, Ethan and Charlotte, their cart filled with expensive ingredients I recognized from cooking shows but had never been able to afford. They were discussing their Thanksgiving menu, Charlotte reading from a list on her phone while Ethan pushed the cart. Organic turkey, imported cheese, wine that cost more than my entire planned meal budget. This wasn't just dinner planning. It was performance art, a deliberate display of the sophisticated life they were building without me. "What about your mother's stuffing recipe?" Charlotte asked. And for a moment my heart leaped. Maybe they were reconsidering. Maybe they wanted to include some piece of our family tradition in their new celebration. Ethan laughed, but it wasn't the warm laugh I remembered from his childhood. This was dismissive, almost cruel. "Trust me, you don't want that recipe," he said. "It's basically stovetop stuffing with some random vegetables thrown in. Nothing like what you'd make." I stood frozen behind the cereal display, listening to my son mock the recipe I'd perfected over decades, the same stuffing he'd requested every year since he was old enough to have opinions about food. The stuffing he'd declared better than restaurant food just 3 years ago. The stuffing that contained ingredients I'd carefully chosen and techniques I'd slowly refined, creating something special from ordinary components because that's all I could afford. Now it was just stovetop stuffing with random vegetables, a joke to share with his wife while they selected ingredients for their superior celebration. They moved on without noticing me, continuing their shopping while I stood there feeling smaller than I ever had in my 62 years. I abandoned my cart and left the store, driving home with shaking hands, and the crushing realization that my son wasn't just excluding me from Thanksgiving. He was rewriting our entire history, turning my love into something embarrassing, my efforts into something inadequate. That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at the recipe box I'd maintained for 40 years. Every card represented a meal I'd made for him, a celebration I'd organized, a tradition I'd tried to build. Now they felt like artifacts from a relationship that had never been as mutual as I'd believed. But somewhere in my chest, beneath the hurt and humiliation, something else was beginning to grow. Something that felt less like sadness and more like anger. Something that whispered that maybe it was time to stop begging for a place in their lives and start showing them what they'd actually lost. Because if they wanted to discover what life looked like without me, I was finally ready to show them. Despite everything, I couldn't stop trying. That's the curse of motherhood. Even when your child breaks your heart, you keep reaching out, hoping to find the person you raised somewhere beneath the stranger they've become. I decided to make one last attempt to bridge whatever gap had opened between us. Maybe if I showed them I could adapt, that I understood their need for a more sophisticated celebration, they'd reconsider. Maybe if I proved I wasn't the embarrassment they seemed to think I was, they'd remember that I belonged at their table. So I did something I'd never done before. I spent money I couldn't afford on ingredients I'd never cooked with, trying to create the kind of meal Charlotte would approve of. I researched recipes online, watching YouTube videos of celebrity chefs preparing dishes with names I could barely pronounce. I drove to 3 different specialty stores, searching for ingredients that cost more than my usual weekly grocery budget. For 2 days, I practiced. I made sage and pancetta stuffing instead of my traditional recipe. I attempted duck confit instead of turkey. I bought expensive wine to cook with, even though I'd never had a taste for alcohol. My small kitchen became a laboratory where I tried desperately to transform myself into the kind of cook who might deserve a place at their refined table. When everything was ready, I packed it all into containers and drove to their house. My hands shook as I rang the doorbell, holding bags of food that represented not just hours of work, but a complete abandonment of everything I'd thought I knew about cooking, about tradition, about who I was. Charlotte answered the door wearing yoga clothes that probably cost more than my car payment. Her face registered genuine surprise, then something that looked almost like panic. "Julia, we weren't expecting you. I brought Thanksgiving dinner," I said, lifting the bags with a smile that felt forced even to me. "I know you wanted something more upscale this year, so I tried some new recipes, gourmet versions of all the traditional dishes." She didn't invite me in. She stood in the doorway like a bouncer, her yoga-toned body blocking any view of the interior. Behind her, I could hear voices, multiple people already gathered for the celebration I'd been banned from. "That's so thoughtful," she said in a tone that made thoughtful sound like an insult. "But we've already got everything handled. We hired a caterer from that new place downtown. You know, the one that did Senator Morrison's campaign dinner? Everything's already set up." A caterer. They'd hired professionals rather than risk my homemade attempts at sophistication. But what crushed me wasn't the expense. It was realizing that they hadn't excluded me because they needed something I couldn't provide. They'd excluded me because they didn't want anything I could provide. "Maybe I could just put these in your refrigerator?" I suggested, desperate to find some way my effort wouldn't be completely wasted. "For leftovers? Or maybe someone would like to try—" "Actually, we're running really short on refrigerator space," Charlotte interrupted. "The caterer brought so much food, and we've got guests bringing wine. You understand?" I stood there holding bags of food I'd spent 2 days preparing, food that had cost me more than I could afford, while my son's wife explained why there was no room for any of it in their house. No room for my food, no room for my effort, no room for me. "Is Ethan available?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I'd love to just say hello. For the first time, Charlotte looked genuinely uncomfortable. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "He's entertaining guests right now. Important clients from his firm. You know how it is. Business never stops, even on holidays." Important clients. The same phrase he'd used to describe every gathering that didn't include me. I wondered if these mysterious important clients were real, or if everyone was automatically more important than his mother. "Just for a minute?" I pressed. "I haven't seen him in weeks. Julia, I really don't think this is a good time." Charlotte's voice had shifted from polite to firm. "Maybe we can schedule something for next week. I know Ethan's been meaning to call you. Meaning to call me, like I was a dentist appointment he'd been putting off." That's when I heard his laugh from inside the house. The same warm, genuine laugh I remembered from his childhood. The one I hadn't heard directed at me in months. He was having a wonderful time at his catered Thanksgiving with his important clients, while his mother stood on his doorstep holding bags of rejected food. "I understand," I said finally, though I understood nothing except that I was no longer welcome in the life I'd spent 30 years building. "I'll tell him you stopped by," Charlotte said, already beginning to close the door. And thank you for thinking of us. It was really sweet. Sweet. Like I was a neighbor who'd brought over excess zucchini from my garden, rather than his mother who'd sacrificed everything to give him the life that now excluded me. I drove home with the rejected food growing cold in my passenger seat, each container a testament to how completely I'd misunderstood my place in their world. The duck confit that had taken me 3 attempts to get right, the stuffing made with ingredients I couldn't even afford, the wine reduction sauce that had required skills I'd never developed because I'd spent my cooking years focused on nutrition and budget rather than presentation and sophistication. Back in my kitchen, I unpacked the containers and stared at food that suddenly looked as pathetic as I felt. These weren't the elegant dishes I'd seen in the videos. They were amateur attempts by someone trying desperately to become something she wasn't. The duck was overcooked. The stuffing was too wet. The sauce had separated. Even when I tried to meet their standards, I failed. I sat at my kitchen table eating expensive duck that tasted like disappointment while imagining them laughing with their important clients over professionally prepared food. I pictured Charlotte telling the story of my pathetic appearance at their door, maybe even showing them the food I'd brought as evidence of how completely I didn't understand their world. His mother showed up with homemade food, she might say. The word homemade carrying the same dismissive tone she'd used to describe something quaint but irrelevant. Can you imagine, at a dinner like this? And they'd all laugh. These important clients who'd never met me but who'd judge me based on Charlotte's carefully crafted narrative. They'd shake their heads sympathetically, understanding completely why such refined people would need to distance themselves from such an embarrassing relative. The worst part was imagining Ethan's reaction. Would he defend me? Would he tell them about the years I'd worked double shifts to pay for his education? Would he mention the nights I'd stayed up helping him with projects, the times I'd gone without so he could have what he needed? Or would he just laugh along, grateful that his wife had handled the awkward situation so smoothly? That night, I called him one more time. This time he answered, "Hi, Mom." His voice was polite but distant, the way he might greet a coworker's spouse at a company party. "I stopped by today," I said. "I brought some food for Thanksgiving." "Yeah, Charlotte mentioned that. That was nice of you." Nice. Not thoughtful. Not appreciated. Just nice. Like I'd done something pleasant but unnecessary. "I was hoping to see you," I continued. "It's been so long since we've talked." "I know. I've been swamped with work. This new partnership track is really demanding. Always work. Always something more important than the woman who'd raised him." "Maybe we could have dinner next week?" I suggested. "Just the two of us, like we used to when you were younger?" The pause stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Actually, things are pretty crazy through the holidays," he finally said. "Charlotte's got us booked solid with parties and events. You know how it is." I didn't know how it was. I'd never lived a life where social obligations took precedence over family, where calendar management required excluding your mother from major holidays. "After the holidays, then?" I tried. "Sure," he said, but his tone suggested he was already mentally scheduling me for some time around never. "I should go, though. We've got guests." "Of course," I said. "Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, sweetheart." "You too, Mom." And then he was gone, back to his catered dinner and important clients and wife who'd made it clear I wasn't welcome. I sat holding the phone long after he'd hung up, listening to the dial tone that sounded like the final note of a song I'd been singing alone for far too long. But something had shifted during that conversation. Maybe it was the complete absence of warmth in his voice, or the way he'd dismissed my invitation without even pretending to consider it. Maybe it was finally understanding that I wasn't dealing with a temporary misunderstanding, but with a permanent reclassification of my role in his life. Whatever it was, I felt something cold and sharp settling in my chest, something that whispered that maybe it was time to stop begging for scraps of affection from people who clearly didn't think I deserved a full meal. Maybe it was time to show them exactly what they'd been taking for granted all these years. The days after Thanksgiving passed in a blur of hollow routine. I went through the motions of living, made coffee I barely tasted, watched television shows I didn't follow, answered calls from well-meaning neighbors who asked about my holiday while I manufactured cheerful lies about how wonderful it had been. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought over leftover pie, her kind eyes searching my face for signs of the truth I was working so hard to hide. "How was dinner with Ethan and his wife?" she asked, settling into my kitchen chair like she had time to listen. "Oh, it was lovely," I heard myself say. "Charlotte is such a wonderful cook. They've really created something special over there. The lies came easier than I'd expected. Maybe because the truth was too humiliating to speak aloud. How do you tell your neighbor that your son banned you from Thanksgiving? How do you explain that the person you raised has decided you're not worth a seat at his table? Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly, sharing stories about her own children's holiday celebrations while I smiled and made appropriate responses. But inside, I was dying a little more with each word, each cheerful assumption about the loving family relationship that existed only in my imagination now. After she left, I stood in my kitchen staring at the slice of pumpkin pie she'd brought, the kind I used to make for Ethan every year, following my mother's recipe that he'd claimed to love. Now I wondered if that had been another lie, another kindness he'd offered to spare my feelings while secretly wishing for something better. I threw the pie away without tasting it. Even someone else's cooking reminded me of my own inadequacy. The real breaking point came 3 days later when I ran into Janet Hoffman at the post office. Janet's daughter lived in the same neighborhood as Ethan, and their families had become friends over backyard barbecues and shared carpools when their children were younger. "Julia," she called out, her voice bright with genuine warmth. "How are you? I heard about Ethan's wonderful Thanksgiving dinner." Susan said it was absolutely elegant, like something from a magazine. My smile felt like it might crack my face. "Oh yes, they did a beautiful job." She said the catering was incredible, and that house. Charlotte has such exquisite taste. Susan was so impressed with the wine selection. Apparently they had bottles she'd only read about in those fancy food magazines. Each word was a small knife, twisting deeper into wounds I was still trying to pretend didn't exist. Susan had been there. Susan had enjoyed the elegant dinner, the expensive wine, the sophisticated atmosphere that was apparently everything my family gatherings had never been. The guest list was so impressive too, Janet continued, oblivious to the damage she was inflicting. Susan said they had people from Ethan's firm, some city council members, even that judge who's been in the papers. Really moving up in the world, that boy of yours. City council members, a judge, important people who mattered, who deserved a place at my son's table in ways I apparently didn't. I wondered if any of them had children. I wondered if their children would ever look at their aging parents and decide they weren't sophisticated enough for their social aspirations. "I'm so proud of him," I managed to say, and that part, at least, wasn't entirely a lie. I was proud of his success, even if that success had required erasing me from his life. "Susan mentioned she asked about you," Janet added, and for a moment my heart lifted. Maybe someone had wondered where I was. Maybe my absence had been noticed, questioned. "She said Charlotte explained that you weren't feeling well. Such a shame to miss a gathering like that, but probably wise to stay home if you were under the weather." Not feeling well. That was the story they'd told. Not that I'd been banned, not that I'd been deemed unworthy of their celebration, but that I'd been too sick to attend. It was almost kind, this lie that protected my dignity while protecting their image. Almost thoughtful, if you ignored the fact that it erased the deliberate cruelty of their exclusion. "Yes, just a little bug," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "Nothing serious." When I got home, I sat in my living room surrounded by 30 years of photographs documenting a relationship that had apparently been one-sided all along. Baby pictures, school photos, graduation shots, candid moments of joy and pride that now felt like evidence of my own delusion. Had I been living in a fantasy all these years? Had I been so desperate to feel needed, so invested in being the perfect mother, that I'd imagined warmth where there was only obligation? Had Ethan been counting the days until he could afford to cut me loose? I picked up a photo from his high school graduation, him in his cap and gown, me beaming beside him with pride radiating from every pore. I remembered that day so clearly. The speeches about how these young people would go out and change the world, the pride I felt watching him walk across that stage, the certainty that whatever he accomplished in life, we'd celebrate together. In the photo, his arm was around my shoulders, his smile genuine and bright, but now I wondered if he'd already been planning his escape, already imagining a future sophisticated enough to require my absence. I pulled out the photo album I'd kept since his birth, turning pages filled with evidence of a love story I'd apparently been writing alone. First steps documented in careful detail, birthday parties where I'd made elaborate cakes with decorations he'd requested, Christmas mornings where I'd worked extra hours for months to afford the gifts he'd wanted. Every page told the same story, Me giving, him taking, both of us assuming that was how it would always be. But what broke me wasn't the photos. It was finding the card he'd made me for Mother's Day when he was 8 years old. Construction paper colored with crayons, his careful third-grade handwriting spelling out words that now felt like accusations. Dear Mom, thank you for being the best mom ever. I love you more than video games. Love, Ethan. P.S. You make the best cookies in the world. The best mom ever. Better than video games, which at the time was the highest compliment he could offer. I'd kept this card for 23 years, treasuring it as proof of his love. Now it felt like evidence of how completely I'd failed to remain worthy of such devotion. What had happened to that little boy who thought I was the best mom ever? When had I become someone who embarrassed him? Someone whose presence at his dinner table would somehow diminish his social standing? I pressed the card against my chest and finally let myself cry. Not the careful, controlled tears I'd been allowing myself in private moments, but the ugly, desperate sobbing of someone whose entire identity had just collapsed. I cried for the little boy who'd once thought I hung the moon. I cried for the years I'd spent working extra shifts instead of dating, choosing his needs over any possibility of my own happiness. I cried for the woman who'd believed that love was enough, that sacrifice was meaningful, that being a good mother guaranteed a place in your child's life forever. Most of all, I cried for the future I'd imagined. Holidays where I'd be the beloved grandmother, sharing stories and traditions with children who'd see me as I'd always seen my own mother, irreplaceable, precious, worthy of love and respect, simply for existing. That future was gone, had probably never existed except in my own imagination. I sat in my living room holding a Mother's Day card from a child who no longer seemed to exist, surrounded by photos of a relationship that had apparently meant more to me than to him, and realized I had two choices. I could spend the rest of my life begging for scraps of affection from someone who'd made it clear I wasn't worth a full meal. I could continue pretending that his wife's politeness was kindness, that his distance was just temporary stress, that somehow I could earn my way back into his good graces if I just tried hard enough. Or I could stop. I could stop calling and being disappointed when he didn't call back. Stop making excuses for his coldness and her cruelty. Stop pretending that the relationship I'd invested everything in still existed in any meaningful way. I could stop being pathetic. The thought surprised me with its clarity, its finality. Somewhere in the depths of my grief, a small voice was whispering something that sounded almost like anger, something that suggested maybe the problem wasn't that I'd failed to be worthy of their love, but that they'd failed to be worthy of mine. Maybe it was time to find out what happened when someone who'd spent 30 years giving everything finally decided to give nothing at all. The crying stopped. The self-pity dried up. And in its place, something cold and sharp and surprisingly liberating began to grow. Something that whispered, let's see how they like it when the woman they've taken for granted completely disappears from their lives. But I still had something they didn't know about. Something that would remind them exactly what they'd thrown away. And when the time was right, they'd hear it. The voice of the little boy who'd once promised he'd never forget me. Maybe it was time to remind him of that promise. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began quietly, in the small spaces between tears and revelation, like light slowly returning after the longest night of the year. I started by doing something I hadn't done in 30 years. I stopped reaching for my phone every time I thought of Ethan. The impulse was still there. That maternal reflex to check in, to share a funny story I'd heard or ask about his day. But now, I let my hand fall back to my side, let the silence stretch where there used to be desperate attempts at connection. For the first few days, it felt like holding my breath underwater. Every instinct screamed at me to surface, to call him, to resume the pattern of pursuit that had defined our relationship for months. But I forced myself to sit with the discomfort, to feel what it was like to not be the one always reaching out. The silence was revealing. My phone, which used to buzz occasionally with his brief responses to my messages, now sat quiet for hours at a time. No one was calling to check on me. No one wondered why I'd suddenly stopped initiating contact. The absence of my efforts created a void that apparently no one felt compelled to fill. This should have hurt more than it did. Instead, it felt like confirmation of something I'd been too afraid to acknowledge. The relationship I'd been fighting to preserve had been sustained entirely by my own energy. When I stopped pushing, the whole thing simply stopped moving. I began to notice other things I'd been too distracted to see. Bills that arrived in my mailbox that I'd been paying without question. Ethan's car insurance, his phone plan, even a credit card I'd co-signed for years ago when he was building his credit. Monthly payments I'd automated so completely that I'd stopped thinking of them as choices rather than obligations. How had I become responsible for a 30-year-old man's expenses while being deemed unworthy of his company? When had supporting him financially become so routine that I'd never questioned whether he deserved that support? I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at the online banking screen that showed months of automatic payments flowing out of my modest checking account into various aspects of his comfortable life. Car insurance that covered a vehicle I'd never been invited to ride in, a phone plan that connected him to everyone except me, credit card payments for purchases he'd never felt the need to discuss with the woman who was paying for them. The numbers were small individually, but together they represented nearly $400 a month. $400 that could have gone toward my own needs, my own comfort, my own future. Instead, it had been quietly subsidizing the lifestyle of someone who'd banned me from Thanksgiving dinner. My finger hovered over the mouse as I navigated to each automatic payment. Such a small action, just a few clicks to cancel transfers that had been running for years. But it felt monumental. Like I was finally admitting that the person I'd been supporting was no longer the child who'd needed my help. The car insurance was first. Cancel automatic payment. Are you sure? Yes, I was sure. The phone plan next. This one stung a little. I'd added him to my family plan when he graduated college, thinking it would help him save money while he established his career. Now that career was successful enough to hire caterers and exclude mothers, but apparently not successful enough to pay his own phone bill. Cancel automatic payment. Are you sure? Yes. The credit card was last, and hardest. I'd co-signed for this card to help him build credit after college, when responsible financial behavior meant including family in your support system. The payments had never been large, but they'd been consistent for 8 years. A small monthly reminder that I was still part of his life, still useful in some measurable way. Cancel automatic payment. When I finished, I felt lighter and more frightened than I'd ever been. Lighter because I was no longer carrying financial responsibilities for someone who'd made it clear I had no other role in his life. Frightened because I was about to discover what happened when the woman they'd been taking for granted stopped giving them things to take. I didn't tell them what I'd done. There was no dramatic announcement, no angry phone call explaining my decision. I simply stopped. Stopped paying their bills. Stopped calling. Stopped trying to insert myself into a life that clearly had no room for me. The first call came exactly 11 days later. I was in my garden, pulling weeds from the flower bed I'd been neglecting since the Thanksgiving disaster, when my phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, my old reflexes kicked in. My heart raced with hope. Maybe he was calling to apologize. Maybe he'd realized how badly he'd hurt me. Maybe Charlotte had finally told him the truth about how cruel they'd been, but I didn't answer. Not because I was playing games or trying to punish him, but because I genuinely wasn't ready to have whatever conversation this would be. After weeks of being the one who called and texted and reached out, I needed to know what he wanted badly enough to pick up the phone himself. He didn't leave a voicemail. The second call came 3 hours later, then a third that evening. Each time, I let it ring, watching his name appear and disappear on my screen like a ghost trying to materialize. Part of me wanted to answer, wanted to fall back into the familiar pattern of being available whenever he needed me, but a stronger part, the part that had been growing steadily since that night with the Mother's Day card, whispered that maybe it was time for him to experience what I'd been feeling for months, the feeling of reaching out and getting no response. By the 5th call the next day, my phone started buzzing with text messages. Mom, call me back. Is everything okay? You're not answering your phone. Mom, this is important. Important. Now I was important. Now, when he needed something from me, my response time mattered. When I'd needed him, needed an explanation, an apology, a simple acknowledgement of my pain, my importance had been negligible. But whatever crisis had prompted this sudden flood of contact was apparently urgent enough to deserve immediate attention. I read the messages, but didn't respond. Let him wonder. Let him experience the anxiety of sending words into silence, of not knowing if he was being ignored or if something was wrong. Let him feel, for just a few hours, what I'd been feeling for weeks. The calls multiplied, not just from Ethan, but from numbers I didn't recognize. Charlotte's phone, their home number, even what looked like office numbers. Was he calling me from work now? Had whatever crisis he was facing become serious enough to disrupt his professional day? My voicemail box filled up. 17 messages I didn't listen to, from a man who hadn't voluntarily spoken to me in weeks. The irony was almost funny. The son who'd been too busy for conversation was now apparently desperate to have one. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, I sat in my living room that evening, looking through photo albums again. But this time, I wasn't seeing evidence of my failure or his rejection. I was seeing something else, a pattern I'd been too close to recognize. Every photo told the same story. Me giving, him receiving, me supporting, him achieving, me celebrating his victories while he moved further and further away from the woman who'd made them possible. In his elementary school graduation photo, I was beaming with pride while he looked past the camera toward something more interesting. In his high school prom picture, I was carefully adjusting his bow tie while he checked his watch. In his college graduation shot, I was applauding in the crowd while he posed with friends who would actually be part of his future. How long had I been loving someone who was already planning to leave me behind? But there, tucked between pages near the back of the album, I found it. The thing I'd almost forgotten about. The recording I'd saved from his childhood. When he was 6 years old, he'd gotten hold of my old answering machine and recorded a message for me while I was at work. The tape was still in my dresser drawer, wrapped in tissue paper like a precious artifact. I hadn't listened to it in years, but I'd kept it through every move, every life change, every moment when I'd worried I was losing connection with my son. I found my old tape player in the closet, the one I'd kept meaning to throw away, but never quite managed to discard. My hands shook slightly as I inserted the tape and pressed play. Static. Then the sound of small fingers fumbling with buttons. Then his voice. So young, so pure, so full of love it took my breath away. "Hi, Mommy. It's me, Ethan. I know you're at work making money for us, and I wanted to tell you something really important. I love you more than all the stars in the sky, and when I grow up, I'm never gonna forget you. Never, ever. You're the best mommy in the whole world. And even when I'm a grown-up with my own house, I'm gonna call you every day and visit you every week and tell you all my secrets, because you're my favorite person ever. And Mommy, when you get old, I'm gonna take care of you just like you take care of me now. I promise. I love you, infinity, +1. The end. The tape clicked off, leaving me sitting in silence with tears streaming down my face. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of remembering who I'd been to him once and who he'd promised to be to me. That little boy's voice, so sincere, so full of love and promises, was about to remind a 30-year-old man what he'd forgotten about himself. But first, I was going to let him wonder a little longer what happened when the woman who'd always been there simply disappeared. The calls became frantic on day 3. Ethan's voice in the messages I still wasn't listening to had shifted from confusion to irritation to something that sounded almost like panic. The numbers calling me multiplied. His work, Charlotte's cell, even numbers I didn't recognize that I suspected were friends or colleagues recruited to help track me down. It was almost amusing, watching my phone light up constantly with calls from people who'd had no interest in hearing from me just days earlier. Now that I'd stopped being available at their convenience, my availability had suddenly become urgent. I went about my life with a serenity I hadn't felt in months. I tended my garden without jumping every time my phone rang. I read books without constantly checking for messages. I cooked meals I enjoyed instead of practicing recipes designed to impress people who'd made it clear I wasn't impressive enough. The freedom was intoxicating. For the first time in recent memory, my days belonged entirely to me. No one's needs took precedence over my own. No one's approval determined my worth. No one's rejection could touch the growing sense of peace I felt in my own company. On the 4th day, my doorbell rang. I was in my kitchen making tea when I heard the sharp, insistent chiming that suggested whoever was outside wasn't planning to give up easily. Through the window, I could see a figure on my front porch, but I didn't hurry to answer. After 30 years of jumping every time someone needed me, I was learning to move at my own pace. The bell rang again, then what sounded like knocking. When I finally opened the door, Charlotte stood on my porch looking nothing like the composed woman who'd dismissed me from their Thanksgiving celebration. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her makeup minimal, her designer clothes replaced with jeans and a sweater that suggested she'd left the house in a hurry. "Julia, thank God," she said, and I was surprised to hear genuine relief in her voice. "We've been trying to reach you for days. Are you all right?" I studied her face, looking for signs of the calculated coldness she'd shown me at their door just 2 weeks earlier, but all I saw was worry, maybe even fear. This wasn't the Charlotte who'd explained why there was no room for my food in their refrigerator. This was someone who needed something badly enough to come to my house and ask for it. "I'm fine," I said, not inviting her in. "Just enjoying some quiet time." "But you haven't been answering your phone. Ethan's been worried sick." Worried sick. About the mother he'd banned from his holiday table. About the woman he hadn't voluntarily called in weeks. The irony was so thick I could taste it. "Has he?" I asked mildly. "How unusual." Charlotte blinked, clearly not expecting this response. She was used to me being eager to please, desperate to smooth over any tension. This calm, slightly detached version of me was apparently new territory. "Julia, is something wrong? You seem different." Different. Yes, I was different. I was no longer the woman who accepted scraps and called them banquets. I was no longer willing to pretend that their casual cruelty was normal family behavior. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said. "I'm exactly who I've always been. It's just that I'm not calling anyone anymore. I figured if people wanted to talk to me, they'd call me. But you're not answering when we call?" "No," I agreed pleasantly. "I'm not." The silence stretched between us while Charlotte tried to process this new dynamic. She was used to being the one with power in our interactions, the one who controlled access and set boundaries. Now she was standing on my porch, asking for my attention instead of dismissing my efforts to give it. "Look," she said finally, her composure beginning to crack. "I think there might be some misunderstanding about Thanksgiving. Maybe we didn't communicate clearly." "Oh no," I interrupted gently. "You communicated perfectly clearly. You told me I was banned. I understood completely." Her face flushed. It wasn't meant to sound so harsh. We just thought it would be easier if we kept it small this year." Easier for whom? I wondered. Easier to exclude me than to explain my presence to their important guests? Easier to pretend they'd created their sophisticated lifestyle without help from the woman who'd sacrificed her own dreams to fund theirs? "It was small," I acknowledged, "and I'm sure it was lovely." "Charlotte, why are you here?" "Ethan's car insurance was canceled," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "And his phone got shut off. And there's some problem with his credit card. The companies say the automatic payment stopped, but we don't understand why. Ethan thinks maybe there's something wrong with your bank account, or maybe someone stole your identity, or there's nothing wrong with my bank account," I said quietly. The realization dawned on her face slowly, like sunrise in reverse. Understanding crept in, followed by something that looked almost like fear. "You canceled them," she whispered. "You canceled the payments." I did. But why?" The question hung between us, absurd in its innocence. Why would I stop paying bills for someone who'd excluded me from his life? Why would I continue supporting someone who'd made it clear my support was expected but not appreciated? "Because I'm not his mother anymore," I said simply. "You made that very clear at Thanksgiving. I'm just some woman who used to be important to him, and some woman who used to be important to him has no business paying his bills." Charlotte's face went pale. "Julia, you're still his mother. Thanksgiving was it was a misunderstanding. We never meant to make you feel unwelcome. You told me I was banned, Charlotte. You stood in your doorway and explained why there was no room for me in your house, in your celebration, in your life. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was clarity. But the bills, Julia, those payments have been automatic for years. Ethan's been counting on them. His credit score is his responsibility now," I finished. "Just like his phone bill, his car insurance, and whatever other expenses I've been covering for an adult man who apparently doesn't need a mother." She stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. The concept that actions might have consequences, that excluding someone from your life might result in losing their support, seemed genuinely bewildering to her. "You can't just stop," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Those are commitments, responsibilities. Yes, they are. They're Ethan's commitments and responsibilities. He's 30 years old, Charlotte. He has a law degree and a successful career. I think he can handle his own bills. But I've always done a lot of things that apparently weren't appreciated or valued. Now I'm doing different things. Things for myself. Charlotte's composure was cracking completely now. Julia, please. This is causing real problems. Ethan's stressed about his credit rating, and with the partnership review coming up at his firm, he can't afford any financial complications. Can't we work something out? Maybe we could set up a payment plan, or you could pay his bills yourselves, I suggested mildly. Novel concept, I know. It's not that simple. We've got the mortgage and Charlotte's student loans, and we just put money down on that vacation to Europe next spring. Europe. They were planning vacations to Europe while expecting me to cover their basic expenses. They had money for international travel, but not for car insurance. Money for caterers, but not for phone bills. Sounds like you need to reassess your priorities, I said. Julia, please. You're being unreasonable. These payments are pocket change for you. The words hung in the air like a slap. Pocket change. $400 a month was pocket change to the woman who shopped at thrift stores and clipped coupons and hadn't taken a vacation in 5 years. Am I? I asked, my voice still calm but carrying a new edge. How do you know what's pocket change for me, Charlotte? Have you ever asked about my finances, my budget, my retirement savings? Or did you just assume that because I've been willing to help, I could afford to help indefinitely? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. We both knew the answer. They'd never asked because they'd never cared. My financial situation was relevant only insofar as it benefited them. Look, she said, switching tactics, maybe we handled Thanksgiving poorly. Maybe we should have communicated better. But this seems like an extreme reaction, cutting off financial support just because of a holiday dinner. Just because of a holiday dinner, I repeated. Just because you banned me from the most important family tradition we shared. Just because you stood in your doorway and explained why I wasn't good enough for your sophisticated celebration. Just because my son let his wife dismiss me like I was some annoying stranger instead of the woman who raised him. My voice was still quiet, still controlled, but something in my tone made Charlotte take a step back. I think you should leave now, I said. And when you get home, you can tell Ethan that his pocket change is no longer available. If he wants to discuss this with me, he can come himself, like an adult, like the man I raised him to be. Julia, wait. But I was already closing the door, leaving Charlotte standing on my porch with the dawning realization that the woman they'd been taking for granted had just changed the rules of engagement entirely. Through my window, I watched her walk slowly back to her car, her phone already pressed to her ear. Calling Ethan, no doubt, to report that his mother had become unreasonable, difficult, vindictive. But I wasn't being vindictive. I was being realistic. I was finally treating them the way they'd been treating me, like people whose needs weren't my responsibility anymore. And tomorrow, when Ethan inevitably showed up at my door, I'd be ready with something that would remind him exactly what he'd thrown away. Something that would show him the difference between the man he'd become and the boy he'd promised to be. He came the next morning, just as I knew he would. I was watering my plants on the front porch when his car pulled into my driveway, the same luxury sedan I'd been helping him insure until a few days ago. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, and I could see him gathering himself, preparing for a conversation he clearly didn't want to have. I continued watering my geraniums, not hurrying to acknowledge his presence. Let him come to me. Let him walk up my front steps and ask for my time instead of demanding it. When he finally emerged from the car, I was struck by how different he looked. Gone was the confident man who'd entertained important clients while his mother stood rejected on his doorstep. This Ethan looked tired, stressed, younger somehow. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled like he'd slept in it. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice uncertain in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child, unsure if he was in trouble. "Hello, Ethan," I replied calmly, not stopping my watering. "You look tired." "I am tired. I've been worried about you. When you didn't answer your phone, I've been fine," I interrupted gently, just taking some time to myself. "I find I have much more free time now that I'm not calling people who don't want to talk to me." He winced. "Mom, can we please talk? Inside?" I considered this for a moment, then set down my watering can. "Of course. Come in." My living room felt different with him in it now. For months, I'd imagined him here, pictured conversations where we'd repair whatever had gone wrong between us. But the man sitting stiffly on my couch bore little resemblance to the son I'd been missing. This was a stranger wearing my child's face, someone who'd come not because he wanted to see me, but because he needed something from me. "Charlotte said you canceled my insurance," he began without preamble, "and my phone got shut off yesterday. Mom, what's going on?" What's going on? As if my withdrawal of financial support was some mysterious phenomenon rather than a natural consequence of being excluded from his life. "I stopped paying bills for someone who made it clear he doesn't consider me family anymore," I said simply. "That's not—" "Mom, you're always going to be my mother? Nothing changes that?" "Nothing except your actions," I replied. "Tell me, Ethan, when was the last time you called me just to talk? When was the last time you asked how I was feeling, what I was doing, whether I needed anything?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I've been busy with work. When was the last time you visited me without needing something? When was the last time you included me in your plans, your celebrations, your life?" "Mom, you're being unfair. Adults have different relationships with their parents. Things change as we get older." "Yes, they do," I agreed. "Children grow up and build their own lives, but they don't usually ban their mothers from family holidays. They don't usually treat the woman who raised them like an embarrassment to be hidden from their friends." His face flushed. "It wasn't like that. Thanksgiving was complicated. Charlotte was stressed about entertaining, and with my work colleagues there." "You were ashamed of me," I said quietly, and watched him flinch like I'd slapped him. "You were worried that having your mother there would somehow diminish your image with your important guests." "That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you introduced me to your colleagues, Ethan? When was the last time you brought them here, to the house where you grew up, to meet the woman who sacrificed everything to give you the education that got you that job?" The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of all the times he'd chosen to keep me separate from his professional life, all the social events where my presence would apparently have been unwelcome. "Mom, I know things haven't been perfect lately, but cutting off financial support is extreme. My credit rating—" "Your credit rating is your responsibility," I said. "Just like your phone bill, your insurance, and everything else you've apparently forgotten how to manage without my help." "I haven't forgotten. We had an arrangement. We had an arrangement where I gave and you took, where I supported your lifestyle while you excluded me from your life. That arrangement has ended." He leaned forward, running his hands through his hair. "Look, I know you're upset about Thanksgiving. Maybe we handled it wrong, but this isn't the way to deal with it. You're hurting both of us over a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. He was still trying to minimize what they'd done, still refusing to acknowledge the deliberate cruelty of their exclusion. "There was no misunderstanding, Ethan. You banned me from Thanksgiving. Your wife told me I wasn't good enough for your sophisticated celebration. You let her dismiss me from your doorstep like I was a solicitor. She meant exactly what she said. And so did you. You made a choice to exclude me from your life. And now you're surprised that I've chosen to exclude you from my financial support. Mom, please, I need those payments. The partnership review is coming up, and any financial complications could hurt my chances. Then you should have thought of that before you decided I wasn't worth a seat at your table." He stared at me, and for a moment, I saw something flicker across his face, not understanding exactly, but maybe the first glimmer of recognition that his actions had consequences he hadn't considered. "I didn't know you were paying for all that stuff," he said finally. The words hung in the air like an admission of guilt. He hadn't known, because he'd never bothered to know. He'd accepted my support so automatically that he'd stopped thinking of it as a choice I was making, rather than an obligation I owed him. "Of course you didn't know," I said sadly. "You never asked. You never wondered how a woman living on a modest pension could afford to subsidize your lifestyle. You just assumed it would always be there, like electricity or running water. You never said it was a problem." "I never said it was a problem because I thought I was helping my son. I thought we were family. I thought the woman who paid your bills deserved basic respect and inclusion in your life." "You do deserve respect." "Do I? Then why haven't I been getting it?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. We both knew there was no good answer to that question. I stood up and walked to my dresser, pulling out the small tape player I'd prepared the night before. His eyes followed my movements with growing confusion. "I want you to listen to something," I said, setting the player on the coffee table between us. "Something you recorded when you were 6 years old." "Mom, what does this have to do with—" "Everything," I said, pressing play. The static filled the room first, then the sound of small fingers fumbling with buttons. Then his voice, so young, so pure, so full of love it made my chest ache. "Hi, Mommy. It's me, Ethan. I know you're at work making money for us, and I wanted to tell you something really important. I love you more than all the stars in the sky, and when I grow up, I'm never gonna forget you. Never, ever. You're the best mommy in the whole world. And even when I'm a grown-up with my own house, I'm gonna call you every day and visit you every week and tell you all my secrets because you're my favorite person ever. And Mommy, when you get old, I'm gonna take care of you just like you take care of me now. I promise. I love you infinity plus one." The end. The tape clicked off, leaving us sitting in silence that felt heavier than gravity. Ethan's face had gone pale, his eyes wide with what looked like shock or recognition, or maybe grief for the child he'd once been. "You kept that?" he whispered. "I kept everything," I said quietly. "Every drawing, every card, every promise you made when you still knew how to love without conditions." Tears were sliding down his cheeks now, and for a moment I saw the little boy who'd recorded that message, the child who'd believed love was permanent and promises were sacred. "I remember," he said, his voice breaking. "I remember making that. I was so excited to surprise you." "You were," I agreed. "You were 6 years old, and you understood something about love that the 30-year-old version of you seems to have forgotten." "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize—" "You didn't realize because you stopped seeing me as a person," I said gently. "I became a service provider instead of your mother, someone who existed to make your life easier without expecting anything in return. That's not what I wanted. That's not who I meant to become. But it's who you did become, and now you have to decide if that's who you want to stay." He was crying openly now, the composed professional facade completely shattered. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be the person who made that recording. You start by remembering that love isn't automatic," I said. "It's a choice you make every day, and lately you've been choosing other things. Can you forgive me? Can we try again?" I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw both the man who'd hurt me and the child who'd loved me unconditionally. The question was whether there was enough of that child left to rebuild what we'd lost. "That depends," I said finally, "on whether you're ready to earn forgiveness instead of just expecting it." The change didn't happen overnight, but it began that very day. Ethan sat on my couch for another hour after the recording ended, not asking for anything, not trying to negotiate his way back into my financial support, just talking, really talking, for the first time in months. He told me about the pressure he'd been feeling at work, the way Charlotte's social ambitions had gradually convinced him that his modest upbringing was something to hide rather than honor. He admitted that somewhere along the way, he'd started seeing me through her eyes, as someone who didn't quite fit the image of success they were trying to project. "I became someone I don't recognize," he said, his voice still thick with tears. "Someone who forgot that you working double shifts to pay for my education was more impressive than any designer suit I could ever wear." I listened without interrupting, watching this man who looked like my son try to find his way back to the boy who'd once promised to take care of me when I got old. When he finally left that afternoon, he didn't ask about the bills. He didn't mention his insurance or his phone plan or his credit rating. He simply hugged me, the first real hug we'd shared in longer than I could remember, and promised he'd be back the next day. "Not because I need anything," he said quickly, "but because I want to see you, because I miss you, because that little boy was right when he said you were his favorite person." The next day, he came with flowers from his own garden, roses he'd grown himself rather than expensive arrangements from the florist. We sat on my porch drinking coffee, and he asked questions he hadn't bothered with in years. How was my health? Was I lonely? Did I need help with anything around the house? For the first time in our conversation, he seemed genuinely interested in the answers. The day after that, he brought Charlotte with him, not the imperious woman who'd dismissed me from her doorstep, but someone who looked genuinely ashamed. She sat in my living room with her hands folded in her lap, looking young and uncertain. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "A real one, not the kind I tried to give you when I was panicking about the bills. What we did at Thanksgiving was cruel and unnecessary, and I convinced myself it was justified because I was intimidated by you." The admission surprised me. "Intimidated by me? By what you represent," she clarified. "You raised an incredible man essentially on your own. You sacrificed everything for his success. You love him unconditionally. and you've earned his respect in ways I worried I never would. Instead of trying to learn from you, I decided you were competition to be eliminated." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "We're giving you this regardless of whether you ever speak to us again. It's not payment for forgiveness. You can't buy that. It's reimbursement for all the bills you've been covering, with interest, because we should have been handling our own responsibilities all along." I looked at the envelope but didn't take it. "I don't want your money, Charlotte." "I know. That's part of what makes this so awful. You've been helping us for years without keeping score, and we repaid that generosity by treating you like an embarrassment." "I was embarrassed," Ethan added quietly. "Not of you, but of myself. Of how dependent I'd become on your help without ever acknowledging it. Of how I'd let Charlotte's insecurities about our different backgrounds influence how I treated you." Over the following weeks, they proved their words with actions. Ethan came by every few days, sometimes alone, sometimes with Charlotte. They brought groceries and cooked dinner in my kitchen, listening to stories about Ethan's childhood that Charlotte had never heard before. They helped with yard work and household repairs I'd been putting off. Most importantly, they asked about my life, my interests, my needs. For the first time in years, I felt seen by them as a complete person, rather than just Ethan's mother. Charlotte surprised me most of all. Once she stopped competing with me for some imaginary prize, she revealed herself to be intelligent, funny, and genuinely caring. She asked about my late husband, about the dreams I'd deferred to raise Ethan, about what I wanted for my future. "I never had a relationship with my own mother-in-law," she confided one afternoon while we worked together in my garden. "She passed away before I met James's father. I think I was so worried about doing it wrong that I convinced myself the safest approach was to keep you at a distance." "And now?" I asked. "Now I realize I missed out on 3 years of getting to know someone remarkable. I'd like to make up for lost time if you'll let me." The real test came when they planned their Christmas celebration. Instead of hiring caterers and excluding me, they asked if I'd host Christmas dinner at my house, not because my cooking was suddenly good enough for their standards, but because they wanted to honor the traditions we'd built together over the years. "Will you teach me to make your stuffing?" Charlotte asked. "The real recipe, not some gourmet version. I want to learn the food that has meaning, not just food that looks impressive." Christmas morning, my small house filled with laughter and conversation in ways it hadn't for years. Charlotte helped me in the kitchen while Ethan set the table, using my grandmother's china that I hadn't brought out since he'd started finding my hosting inadequate. During dinner, Ethan raised his glass. "I want to make a toast," he said, his voice serious. "To my mother, who taught me everything important I know, even when I was too proud to remember the lessons, and to Charlotte, who was brave enough to admit when she was wrong and wise enough to change." He paused, looking directly at me. "And I want to make a promise. The same promise I made when I was 6, but with the understanding of a man who knows how precious it is. I will never forget you. I will call you regularly not because I need something, but because I love you. And when you need care, I will be here to provide it. Not because I owe you, but because that's what family does." The little boy's promise, remade by a man who'd learned what it really meant. But the most meaningful moment came after dinner, when we were all doing dishes together. Charlotte looked up from drying a plate and said, "Julia, would you like to come with us to that New Year's party at Ethan's firm? I know it's short notice, but I realized we've never properly introduced you to his colleagues. It's time they met the woman who made his success possible, not as an obligation or a courtesy, but as someone they were proud to include." That spring, when Ethan received the partnership he'd been working toward, the first call he made was to me, not to share the news as an afterthought, but to invite me to the celebration dinner as his guest of honor. "None of this would have been possible without you," he said. "I want everyone there to know that." As I got ready for that dinner, putting on my best dress and the pearls my mother had left me, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months earlier, the desperate mother begging for scraps of attention from a son who'd forgotten her value, the woman who'd measured her worth by other people's willingness to accept her presence. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone who knew her own worth, who commanded respect rather than begging for it, who understood that love freely given could be just as freely withdrawn when it wasn't valued. But most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the consequence of their own choices. By stepping back, by refusing to accept unacceptable treatment, I'd given Ethan the space to miss me, to recognize what he'd lost, and to choose to fight for it back. At the partnership dinner, As I sat at the head table listening to speeches about excellence and achievement, Ethan stood to address the room. "I want to thank someone special tonight," he said, his eyes finding mine across the crowded restaurant. "My mother, Julia Morrison, who taught me that real success isn't measured by what you achieve, but by how you treat the people who helped you achieve it. She showed me that integrity isn't just a professional requirement, it's a way of life. And recently, she reminded me that love isn't something you can take for granted, it's something you have to earn every day." The applause that followed felt different from any recognition I'd ever received. It wasn't polite acknowledgement or obligatory gratitude. It was genuine respect from people who understood that the woman they were honoring had shaped not just a successful lawyer, but a good man. Later that evening, as Ethan drove me home, he reached over and squeezed my hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For not giving up on me, even when I'd given up on us. For loving me enough to let me face the consequences of my choices. For teaching me that it's never too late to become the person you promised to be." I squeezed his hand back, feeling the calluses he'd developed from working in my garden, evidence of the man he was choosing to become. "That little boy always knew who he wanted to be," I said. "He just needed to remember." As we pulled into my driveway, I looked at my small house with its flower boxes and front porch light, and realized it had become something it had never been before. Not just a place where I lived, but a home where I was valued, respected, and truly loved. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting everything you thought you wanted. Sometimes it's discovering you're worth more than you ever believed, and teaching others to see that worth too. At 62, I'd learned that it's never too late to demand the love you deserve. And sometimes, if you're patient and strong enough, you might just get it.